Hi, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and also seeing some new faces here tonight. My name is Rendy Zhang. I'm the programs director with the World Affairs Council. I hope you all had a very nice summer, and thank you so much for being with us here tonight. Now I would like to hand the mic over to the acting Consul General of the Consulate General of Brazil in Houston, Mr. Roberto Ardenghi, to introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much, Rendy. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for the Greater Houston Council for this invitation. It's a pleasure as the official representative of Brazil to be with you today and to discuss this amazing country that is Brazil. We are very lucky today. I think that first to congratulate the organizers because they find the exact date for this event, because right now we have in Brazil the Congress, the Senate meeting, and they are discussing the possible impeachment of our President Dilma Rousseff. So it's a very political the situation there in Brazil. We just survived the Olympics Games in the country. It was a lot of concern, of course, for us from the government to have such a big event in Brazil, but I think that we survive well. Of course, Brazil has a particular way of organizing things, sometimes a lot of attention and stress the days before the event, but at the end, I think that we show not just how the country is organized in terms of being prepared for have a big event, but also to show the culture and the particularities of the country, and that was very interesting for their point of view. I'm very happy today to introduce for you our keynote speaker, and he's a big expert in Brazil. I have the chance to talk with him some minutes ago before we start this session. And Mr. Brian Winter is a Reuters correspondent regarded as a leading expert on Latin American issues. Within 1 decade, he was based in São Paulo, in Buenos Aires, and in Mexico City. He has authored and co-authored four books in Latin America, including two specific about Brazil. The one is The Accidental President of Brazil. He wrote this book together with former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. And the second one is Why Soccer Matters, a New York Times bestseller, which he wrote with the Brazilian soccer legend Pelé. So it's very interesting that he covered the two most important issues right now in Brazil, the soccer and the politics. So it's very, very interesting, these both works. Mr. Winter was born in Texas. He's editor-in-chief of Americans Quarterly. You have the chance to see some of the last issue of this very interesting magazine, the Americans Quarterly, and he is also vice president for policy at American Society, the Council of the Americas. A best-selling author, columnist, and analyst. Winter is also frequently consulted speaker for international media events and conferences. So it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Winter, and I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's always humbling to talk about Brazil with Brazilians present. It's wonderful to be back in Texas. Don't tell anybody, I'm from Dallas. Sorry about that. But in any case, it is, as was noted in the introduction, it's a fortuitous day to be here. I want to start by showing you the front page this morning in Brazil, and this is with the impeachment proceedings underway. Yesterday was the day when President Dilma Rousseff went to the Senate and she spoke for about an hour, and then she took questions for, I think it was between 11 and 13 hours by the time it was all said and done. And that's I'll just show you with the laser, that's her over there, and this is the Senate floor. I imagine that many of you have been watching Brazil carefully these last couple of weeks because of the Olympics, and now it's kind of front page news. It was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal today. And I wouldn't be surprised if many of you are just as bewildered by Brazil as you were 2 months ago. And if that's the case, don't worry, because that's a fairly common experience. I think that Brazil remains somewhat of an enigma to the rest of the world. Beyond the fact that we've learned in the last couple of weeks that you can't expect to be able to urinate on a gas station wall and get away with it. But beyond that, we know that it's the world's 5th largest country in terms of size and in terms of population. It's the world's 9th biggest economy, ranked between India and Canada. But beyond that, we've seen kind of this, what appears to be a kind of darker side of Brazil over these last couple months with the not so much the Olympics, which ended up going more or less okay, but with this impeachment trial, that's Dilma again right there. And then, of course, many of you will have read about sorry, this having some clicker malfunction here. This is an image of the pollution in Rio. Many of you will also have read about the corruption scandal involving Petrobras, which I know that because of the energy sector here in Houston, that's something that many of you here have followed with particular attention. And I'm going to talk about all those things tonight, but I wanted to start by talking to you a little bit about Brazil's history, because I think it helps frame a bit what's going on right now. And I think that a lot of what's happening is actually part of a positive process. I feel like it's part of Brazil becoming a more stable democracy with better functioning institutions and a better functioning legal system. And there are some people who, when I say that, they look at me like I'm crazy. And the only way that I can explain why I think that way has to do with the knowledge that I've accumulated over the years writing these books about Brazilian history and the things that have happened in a relatively short amount of time. So this is the book that I wrote with Pelé in 2014. You can see, as often happens in the ghostwriting business, that's his name there. And then if you have really good eyesight, you can see down here in little tiny print, that's me. And, I started working with him in 2013, which was the year before Brazil hosted the World Cup. And the way these books work is you sit down with somebody and you talk to them about their life and you try to hear some good stories and you use that as sort of your base for building the book. And if you'll briefly indulge me with a little story from when we started working together. The first time we sat down, I was just trying to get him talking. I said, I'd done a little research beforehand. I said, Pelé, you were at Studio 54 in the 1970s, and you shared a table with Mick Jagger, Rod Stewart, Liza Minnelli, and Andy Warhol. What was that like? And Pelé goes, he sort of smiles, he goes, oh yeah. He goes, man, Rod Stewart, great guy. Loves Brazil, loves our people, loves our happiness and our dance. Loves soccer, used to be a good player, awesome guy, really love Rod Stewart. Now, I don't know if any of you have tried to ghostwrite books before, but there's not a lot you can do with that. And I thought, well, okay, maybe what happens at Studio 54 stays at Studio 54, and he just didn't want to talk about it. So I decided to try a different tack. I said, Pelé, you were at Michael Jackson's 18th birthday party. What was that like? What was he like back then? How do you think he changed over the years? Were you sad when he died? And Pelé, I swear to you, Pelé goes, oh, Michael Jackson, great guy. loves Brazil, loves soccer, loves the happinesses of our people and the way we dance, and you know, just all around great guy. Well, you can imagine the panic with which I left this first meeting. And I couldn't, you know, I started asking all these kind of existential questions about maybe he didn't like me, or maybe I was asking the wrong questions. And what I eventually came around to, and what I eventually realized, was that Pelé's been around for a long time. Pelé is 75 years old. And he has been one of the world's most famous people since he won the World Cup for the first time in 1958. Okay, that was 2 years after Elvis's first #1 hit. That's how long Elvis has been around, or I'm sorry, that's how long Pelé has been around. And, you know, he doesn't really, he's met every US president since Lyndon Johnson. I have some photos here. So that's Pelé as a teenager, but this here, again, there's like a delay on this, my apologies. Guys, do you have one with maybe a slightly stronger battery? There we go. That's Pelé with Robert F. Kennedy. And then if you go to the next slide, you all know who that is. And he's met everybody, because he's been famous, he's been one of the world's most famous people for 56 years, which is another way of saying Pelé does not care about Rod Stewart. And the reason I tell you this story was because as I sat down to start telling the story of his life, I realized how much Brazil has changed in these last 75 years, and really in just one lifetime. The degree of change and progress is actually, it's really extraordinary. Can we go to the next slide? So this is Pelé when he was about 8 years old and about the 3rd grade. And let me just tell you a little bit about the Brazil that he grew up in. He was born in 1941 in Três Corações, which is in the state of Minas Gerais. And his dad was a soccer player who had showed some promise, but hurt his knee during an era when there was no sports medicine to speak of, and really for people who were poor, there was no medicine to speak of per se. And so the injury healed badly. And as a result, there were long periods where the family was left without any income to speak of. And let me read a short passage from the book. This is Pelé speaking in his voice. He says, "My siblings and I wore secondhand clothes, sometimes stitched from sacks used to transport wheat. There was no money for shoes. On some days, the only meal Mom could make us was bread with a slice of banana, perhaps supplemented by sacks of rice and beans that Uncle Jorge brought from his job at a general store. Now, this made us lucky compared to a great many Brazilians. I have to say that we never went hungry. But there was that constant anxiety, which we all felt, including the kids, about where our next meal would come from. Anybody who has ever been that poor will tell you that uncertainty, that fear, once it enters your bones, it's like a chill that never leaves you. To be honest, I sometimes feel it even today." Now, I think we can all agree that's poor. What he's describing, that's poor. But in the Brazil of Pelé's youth, these experiences were actually fairly common. It was plagued by a level of pestilence and disease that is hard to fathom today. Half the country during that era was barefoot. More than half were illiterate. In some areas of the country, every other baby died before turning 1 year old. Life expectancy, which is a great metric for a number of reasons, was 46 years. So someone born the age during that period in the 40s could expect to live 46 years. That is actually worse than anything you see in the world today. Not even sub-Saharan Africa has a life expectancy that low. The world's worst today, by give you some comparison, is Chad, where life expectancy at birth is 50. Afghanistan is 51. So again, Brazil was 46. During that era, the United States life expectancy was 69. Now, there are lots of explanations for why Brazil was so undeveloped. Some of it had to do with political instability. Some of it had to do with geographic distance. But there are just a few things that I'd like to center on, again, just to explain to you what Brazil was like during that period. One of the factors that made the country so poor was slavery. According to the Transatlantic Slave Database, 10 times more slaves were brought over the centuries to Brazil than to the United States. Pelé's grandmother, who lived with them in their house in Três Corações, was a daughter of slaves. So this, he was not far removed from this reality. Brazil was the last country, not only the country that imported the most slaves, but it was also the last country in the hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888, 2 decades after the end of the US Civil War. Today, just to give you some idea of the proportions that this created, slightly more than half of Brazil's population claims African blood. And what happened was that these people were basically turned, when slavery was abolished, they were kind of left to their own devices. There was no education system to speak of for them. There was no healthcare system. And this, again, I think largely explains the world as it existed in Brazil in the 1940s. Now, there were pockets of prosperity. Some of you may have heard that Sao Paulo has the largest Japanese population of any city outside Japan. Sao Paulo, in the city legislature, 1 in 10 people have Lebanese or Syrian last names. The mayor of Sao Paulo today is named Haddad. The previous mayor was Kassab. But the conditions under which you arrived in Brazil for a long time tended to dictate what your role in society was. And, Pelé's family was poor, and as a result, he played soccer in the streets with wadded up socks, mangoes, grapefruit, pretty much anything they could find because they had no money for a ball. And when they needed shoes for a city soccer tournament, he kind of sheepishly admits that they stole sacks of peanuts in order to be able to afford them. And the net effect of all this, kind of a funny story, his mother was terrified that he would grow up to be a no-good soccer player just like his dad. And when she caught him, quote unquote, playing soccer, she would spank him. But, it sort of worked out where he turned out he was pretty good, and he pursued a career in that anyway. There are a few slides here next that show, Pelé did make it to the World Cup, like I said, in 1958. You can just leave it there for a moment. He was just 17. He was a true talent. He was 5'7", only weighed 120 pounds. The circumference of his thighs was actually greater than that of his waist at the beginning of his playing career, again, somewhat reflecting where he came from. But he went on the world stage at the World Cup in Sweden in 1958, had an amazing performance, held it together, was very composed, and then when the tournament ended, he scored a goal as time was running out. I love this next image here, which is he just, after showing so much composure, he just completely lost it. And I love this photo of him. And through his lifetime, from that point on, Brazil then embarked on a period of very fast economic growth. And I don't have time tonight to tell you, at least during this initial presentation, the reasons for that. But what ended up happening was between the period of 1950 and 1980, if you look at all the major economies around the world, only Japan grew faster than Brazil. That was followed by a period of stagnation for about 15 years. And then again in the last decade, we had a period where 40 million people were brought out of poverty. And the Brazil of today is very radically different from that poor country that I have described. So if you go to the next slide, I want to show you, some of you may remember this Economist cover from 2009. It was followed 4 years later by this. I think that these portrayals of boom and bust tend to get overblown a bit. And part of the reason is because so many people are dazzled by Brazil's potential. It has a quarter of the world's arable land. It has the world's biggest reserves of fresh water. It has offshore oil, as many of you know, that was discovered last decade as well. But it actually, again, over time, and especially over these last 75 years, again, one lifetime, the progress has been pretty astounding. So if you look, despite the economists' kind of portrayal of the boom and bust, this is actually their own graph that they put together showing GDP expansion over since 1900. And some of you may not be able to see this extremely well. Can I sort of, hello, does this work? Can I wander over here? This is the period right here when you saw really strong expansion with growth rates that sometimes were in excess of 10% a year. Here is the boom of recent years that sort of got everybody's attention and won Brazil the right to host the World Cup and Olympics. The GDP growth was not as dramatic, but some of the social gains were. They still brought about 40 million people out of poverty and into the middle class. But you can see there, it's really more boom than bust. And there's never been a recession, for example, longer than 2 years. So where do we end up with all of this? What's the takeaway? So let me show you here. This is, and again, I apologize if some of you are very far away, and so you may not be able to see this, but this is GDP since 1960, this is per capita GDP since 1960, expressed in thousands of dollars. So this is $2,000 here at the bottom, $12,000 over here, and then this shows you here the really dramatic rise during the last decade, and here's the fall. This is the recession that you've all read about now. What you make of this, I think, depends a little bit on the standard to which you're holding Brazil. Let me show you Brazil compared to some dynamic Asian economies. The blue line down here is Brazil, this is South Korea, and this is Japan. Well, if you compare it to East Asian countries, Brazil doesn't come out so well, but if you compare it to other countries in Latin America, here's Brazil up top, here's Mexico, and here's Argentina over that same period. And more importantly, this is a comparison of the Brazil of Pelé's youth compared to Brazil today. And if you look at some of these indicators, it's really pretty astounding the development that you've seen in one, in one lifetime. So I think it also explains why Brazilians tend to be optimists, especially if you look down towards the bottom of the social pyramid where people have progressed the most. I think that a kid who's being born in comparable circumstances to where Pelé was born in the 1940s today has a pretty good chance, as the statistics show, of being enrolled in school. This school enrollment figure is it's for kids ages 7 to 14. Pelé dropped out basically when he was in 4th grade. That was a pretty common experience at the time. Today, 91% of those kids are enrolled. Life expectancy, which I talked about earlier, previously 46 years, that was a 23-year gap with the United States. Today, that gap has been closed to just 6 years. And so, I feel like some of this gets lost in the headlines and in some of the coverage. And the Brazilian optimism may be indecipherable to you if you haven't seen this. And look, I'm not trying to spin this as if this crisis that's happening right now isn't severe. This is, statistically speaking, the worst recession Brazil has ever had. The corruption scandals that have been detected are very serious. The level of political instability, also very serious. But I think if you are aware of this trajectory that the country has had over the last few decades, you tend to see things in a somewhat different light. Let me give an example. This is Marcelo Odebrecht. Marcelo this is really, I mean, Roberto, who would the equivalent be in the United States? This is, I mean, this was one of Brazil's most important business leaders. This was the equivalent of watching Bill Gates get led away to jail. And this was a guy who was supposed to be untouchable. And here he is, being led away. Is it because there's more corruption in Brazil than there is, for example, in Mexico or Argentina? I don't personally believe that's the case. I actually think that as part of this story of progress with both the economy and Brazil's democratic institutions over the last 30 years, I think the judicial sector has developed an independence and technical skill that has allowed them to take some of these people away to jail for the first time. The guy who's leading this is Sergio Moro, who's kind of like the Brazilian Elvis right now. I've been out with him in Brazil, and you've never seen anything like it. Perhaps even Pelé might be impressed by the level of adulation and celebrity around this guy. This is the judge who's overseeing the Petrobras probe. And he is actually, according to polls, the only public figure in Brazil right now who has higher approval than disapproval. And that tells you something about where the country's at. With everything that's going on, with all the problems that Brazil has, some of which we've seen sort of exposed on the global stage over the last few weeks with the coverage of the Olympics, with pollution and unemployment and crime, the number one issue that Brazilians identify in polls is corruption, because they believe that the silver lining to this crisis that they're going through right now is the fact that this guy and others are finally sending some of these criminals away to jail and potentially purging corruption or much of the corruption from the system. I personally believe that the objective, if they continue to succeed, you're not going to eliminate corruption because that's impossible. But if Brazil was previously on a 1 to 10 scale, if the level of corruption in Brazil was previously, I don't know, if Brazil was a 6, I think the goal is to take it down to, maybe a 4. And that's progress. I mean, that's how rule of law gets implemented over time. And the magazine that I edit, some of which some of you have picked up copies, it's called America's Quarterly. It's really the only magazine that looks at the whole region, looks at politics, business, and culture. We actually took this guy and put him on our cover earlier this year, in part to showcase, this is him in the middle, and then this is a Colombian over here and a Guatemalan over here, because part of what's happening in Brazil actually reflects some trends that you're seeing across a lot of Latin America right now. I wanted to talk a little bit about this guy just because of the timing today with our, he may be officially confirmed as Brazil's only president at about, I think the latest forecast, they're saying in the press right now that it should be about 2:30 a.m. tonight when Dilma is formally removed, which probably means 4 or 4:30 based on, my sort of inexact sense of the way the trains run in Brazil. His name is Michel Temer. He's a constitutional lawyer. He's 75. He was Dilma's vice president. They ran together, but he's from a different party. And in practice, he's likely to be much more towards the political center or even the center right than Dilma was, especially on economic policy. He is not popular. His approval rating is about 15%. That's only a bit higher than where Dilma was. But again, you have to remember that that's very much the mood right now in Brazil. Everybody except the judge is underwater, to use the language of political analysts. Their disapproval is higher than their approval. The big challenge facing him is that many members of his party are also implicated in this probe at Petrobras. There has been, I think, one media report suggesting that maybe Temer himself was involved in accepting illegal campaign funds from I forget whether it was one of the big construction companies. Temer rigorously denied this and said that it was a legal donation that was immediately reported. But the takeaway and the important thing to communicate here is that even though Dilma is likely to get impeached and definitively removed from office tonight, the corruption probe will not stop. And as a result, the repercussions and shockwaves generated by the probe also will not stop. So it's likely to be a somewhat unstable environment for some time to come. So I think that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you. Hi.
So we have some question cards out there. If you have any questions, please write your questions on the blue cards. And I'm going to start with a few questions here. So the first one is very interesting. During the 1960s, the military took control of the government. So if the Brazilian economy does not pick up anytime soon, do you see that the military would do something similar to what they did in 1960s again?
That's a good question, and it's one that I get a lot. And I think that, you know, the last few months and years have been very humbling for those of us who talk about Brazil, because I have to say, no one saw a crisis of these dimensions coming as recently as a year and a half ago. So many of us have learned to say, you know, never say never when it comes to Brazil. That said, I will say the one thing that absolutely will not happen in Brazil is a military dictatorship. It is the one thing, and it has to do, again, with some of the dynamic that I was just explaining here. People are committed to the construction of rule of law and the building of democratic institutions. And some of that has become, you know, there are a lot of people who believe that this impeachment process is in some ways a disruption of that progress. That's debatable, but ultimately what everybody on all sides of this impeachment wants is the continued construction of democracy, because they understand, in part because of, you know, the human rights abuses of that dictatorship and, you know, other problems during that era. At least, you know, the vast majority of Brazilians understand the importance of democracy.
Okay, great. It's nice to get a definitive answer like that.
Yeah, I mean, that is literally, like I said, that is the one thing I feel like you can rule out in today's Brazil.
Okay, very well. So now I'm gonna turn to the oil and gas industry a little bit. We have a very specific question here. Will we see Petrobras owning non-operating minority stakes in future offshore projects?
Apparently not. By the way, I feel like he's watching me. Can we turn him off? Thank you.
Now,
there you
is
go.
it better to have...
Okay, that'll do. Thank you. You just sort of very delicately covered him up. I appreciate that. Okay, so the story of Brazilian oil over the last 10 years is insane. Actually, you know what? We have an expert here with us tonight. So, Roberto, would you be able to come up just for a second to help me with this one? I would say, in somewhat undiplomatic terms, that Brazil was dealt a good hand back in the 2000s with the discovery of all this offshore oil. And it seems possible that they then turned around and overplayed what they were dealt and passed a bunch of local content rules that were well-intentioned. What they wanted to do was not just export the oil. They wanted to build a shipping industry and a whole technology that would generate jobs and would then allow them to become sort of the logistics experts that other countries, perhaps including in Africa, would be able to call on for offshore oil. But it didn't work out. Brazil was not capable of producing the local content as it was laid out by law. And so the indications are now, if I'm not mistaken, that, there have been some media reports suggesting that a lot of these local content rules are going to be waived and sort of reformed. Did I get that right?
Yes, you get it right. We have discovered these pre-salt reserves. They hold, the last estimates, 40 billion barrels of oil in the offshore area, very close to Rio and São Paulo. So it's not just the size, but also the location, very important. Those reserves were discovered by Petrobras in 2006. They have been developed, these areas, so the last 10 years, and they have already achieved a level of production of 1 million barrels of oil per day.
Mm-hmm.
Just for you to have an idea, Brazil produces 2.5 million barrels a day of oil. So 1 million of this oil is coming from those offshore, and it's very sizable, big reserves, but very challenging because they are ultra deep waters, right in the 186 miles from the coast. So very challenging. Why we have arrived this point? Because Petrobras, in spite of all these corruptions and issues, Petrobras is a very, very good company in terms of oil. Petrobras has received a lot of awards recently because of the capabilities of its engineering team, etc., etc. So they have been able to do what, if just for comparing, here in the Gulf of Mexico, this level of production took 14 years to be achieved, what Brazil we did in 10 years. So it's really a remarkable thing. But what happened is that what we have reached a conclusion recently is that we have to change a little bit these rules around not just local content, but also operatorship. But up to now, only Petrobras was allowed to operate those areas. So what the government is considering, Temer has already indicated that he will go for these proposals, and it's already almost passed in the Congress already, this amendment to the law, lowering the local content, so opening for foreign companies to sell products and services to this kind of exploration, but also allow other companies, foreign companies, to be the operator of these fields. Petrobras, in this case, will hold 30% of the project. That's what I think the question arises on the minor participation of Petrobras. So 70% could go to a foreign operator and 30% with Petrobras, and this foreign company will be allowed to operate the field. What's very important, because we think that Brazil could learn more from the operatorship from other players. So that's basically the answer.
See, I told you he was the right guy to answer that one. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Brian and Mr. Ardenghi. And now I have a question from a student at the University of Houston, Renata. How do you think that the multinationals and the businesses in general will be impacted, considering the actual situation going on in the country right now? It's a big question.
That is a big question. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about what people expect is going to happen with the economy. I think economists are going to have an interesting time for the next 30 years studying what went wrong in Brazil. I think there are lots of different theories that you can go to, but one of them is that Dilma in particular was overly involved in the management of certain aspects of the economy that are best left to the private sector. And of course, she also essentially ruined the budgetary situation by essentially fudging the numbers going back a couple years, but especially in 2014 in order to help guarantee her re-election. And that, of course, is the technical cause for which she's presently being impeached. It's not the corruption per se, it's that sort of narrow issue. There's every reason to believe that the new government under Temer will be more transparent in its handling of the budget. But as we all know, and as we know here in the United States, cutting budgets is tough. And the budget deficit, the real budget deficit last year, was more than 10% of GDP. That compares to the worst levels of the financial crisis here in the United States. We had budgets, we had deficits that were around that level, certainly in 2009, and if I'm not mistaken, it was close in 2010 as well. So whether Temer is able to quickly make progress in closing that gap without destroying the economy and sort of depressing economic activity in the process, I think is going to be the big challenge. If we can get confidence back and get that virtuous cycle of investment moving again, the outlook for all companies, multinational and otherwise, should improve. One final word, the expectation right now for economic growth next year is 1.2%. That's the average forecast of something like 25 different economists in Brazil. So that's not a roaring back kind of economic recovery. So things are going to remain sort of uncertain for a while still.
Okay, great. So just a few more questions. Now going back to the Olympics a little bit, what has been the financial fallout for the Brazilian government after the Rio Olympics? And given that the IOC has sole discretion over the disbursement of profits, will the Brazilian economy benefit from that at all?
These are great questions. This one in particular, it's complicated. I mean, what implicit in that question is were the Olympics worth it for Brazil? That's a tough one. I actually have a question I want to ask you. Was there anybody here who actually went to Rio? Okay, so we have 2 people there. And then how many watched it on television? Okay, thank you. So here's my question. It's for those of you who watched it on TV. Did any of you come away more eager to travel to Rio after watching it on TV? If yes, please, if so, raise your hand. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, that's more than when I asked this question last night out in Woodlands. You must be more adventurous than that crowd was. I feel like at that level, for this group, for people who watched it on TV, I feel like it was kind of a missed opportunity. And the U.S. media and the way it portrayed it may have been, in some respects, complicit in that. But I feel like it was not the massive, glowing ad for Rio that people originally thought it would be when Brazil first won the right to host the Olympics in 2009. Now, those of you who actually went to Rio, would you go back? Yes, absolutely, right? Because the people who actually went, and there were about 400,000, or no, I think 500,000 foreigners. They released these figures in the last 10 days or so. There were about 500,000 foreigners who did enter the country during that period. Not all of them were at the Olympics, but a lot of them were. And the polls that they did afterwards found people were really impressed. Why? Because as the expression goes in Brazil, and I actually happen to believe it's true as somebody who lived there for 5 years, the best part of Brazil is the Brazilians. Again, I'm partial, but this will sound like sort of PR nonsense, but I think they're the world's nicest people. Am I wrong? I mean, they're really amazing, and you didn't get that on TV, unfortunately. So there are questions about how some of the IOC money will be distributed. Some of this has to do with the financial problems in Brazil. There was a report recently that Rio de Janeiro state government is going to declare falencia, which it's bankruptcy, in the next few weeks, which could again kind of change the way that we perceive the way all this spending happens. To answer my own question, and I think we all kind of reserve the right to change our responses as time goes by and we found out more things. I'm not sure it was worth the cost, just purely from the perspective of Brazil. When you look at how much money they spent and what they're likely to get out of it, I don't think it was an overwhelmingly negative thing from a financial point of view. I think it's close, but if I had to pick sort of one edge of the spectrum, I would say probably not quite the big bonus that they hoped it would be.
Okay, great. Thank you. And while on the topic of the Olympics, and also because you've talked about Pelé so much in the presentation, it begs the question: where was Pelé at the Rio Olympics, and is he healthy? How is he doing right now?
I don't know. He doesn't want to take any more of my questions about Rod Stewart, so I haven't spoken to him for a while. No, it's kind of a mystery right now. I haven't had any contact with him for about a year. His sort of access, he has a very non-traditional situation, where he actually sold his personal rights a couple years ago to a rights management group in return for a pretty good payout and some equity. But as a result of that, he actually does not control his own schedule. And one of the things that came out before the Olympics was he actually came out in public and said, I want to go light the torch, but I'm not sure my sponsors will let me. And this briefly sparked a Free Pelé hashtag on Twitter. When he said he couldn't go, they said it was for health reasons. But he has some other engagements scheduled in the next couple of weeks, and I think there's one in England. And I've been following this with some sort of attention because I really like the guy. I think he's a great guy. He loves Brazil. No, I'm kidding. So that's kind of a long-winded. I don't know, but I gave you a little bit of the speculation.
Okay, great. And now on to our last question. How should the next U.S. president handle the U.S.-Brazil relations? And I know in one of your recent articles and letters in America's Quarterly, you mentioned that the future president should treat Latin America as an equal. So I'm wondering if that would be, a partial answer to this question.
I think that's important, and for those of you who have picked up the magazine, not to make too much of an ad out of this, but please, my email address is on the third page, and if you read it and you like it, please send me an email and let me know what you did like, didn't like, and if you really love it, perhaps consider subscribing. I think the way that we interact with Latin America has evolved as Latin America has changed and as the world has changed. I think there was an old dynamic where during the Cold War, we sort of looked at it as pieces on a checkerboard where you were either on our side or the Soviet side. And now it's kind of we're in a multipolar world, and I think it's important not to take these countries for granted. And these are countries that certainly had their problems over the years, if you talk about Latin America generally. But the story over the last 20 years in Latin America, for the most part, is one of progress. There are exceptions, Venezuela obviously being a huge exception to that story of success. But with the exception of Venezuela, which I personally think can no longer really be qualified as a democracy, and Cuba, the rest of the hemisphere is democratic now. And this massive ascendancy of people into the middle class over the last 20 years in Brazil has been repeated, albeit on a smaller scale, in a lot of countries, including Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and others. And so I think these are countries that are worthy of our respect. With regards to Brazil, I think all of these countries are very sensitive to anything that smells like the old rhetoric of yesterday. And so I think that even the way that we talk about countries and we interact with each other matters a lot. With regard to the specific agenda, getting past sort of the atmospherics and the specific agenda between Brazil and the U.S., there may be some opportunities on trade. This new government, the Temer government, has said some things about integrating into the world in a way that greater than right now. One thing that you may not know about Brazil is that on the one hand, while it is the world's biggest exporter of a lot of commodities, including orange juice, beef, it sort of oscillates back and forth between 1 and 2 on soy and iron ore. So all of these things are true, but actually if you take exports plus imports and divide that by GDP, the number you're left with is the lowest in all of our hemisphere. Brazil is actually the Americas, and in the Americas, it is the country where trade plays the least important role. Brazil is essentially a large, mostly protected domestic consumer market. Similar in some respects to the United States, where so much of what we do, for better or for worse, is consumer spending. And so now, this government, this is not a secret. The Temer government realizes this, and they've started to say some things about being willing to start opening up. The problem is their timing may not be very good, because of course we have a trade deal that we've cut here in the United States recently called TPP, as you all know, and we now have 2 presidential candidates in this election who are against it. So I think it's safe to say that at some level the mood in the States right now is not really in favor of trade. So, a pessimist might say that Brazil kind of missed a window for being included in trade deals, and it might have to wait a while until another opportunity comes along. But I guess we'll see how this election goes here and sort of what happens into 2017 and beyond.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Winter, for a most wonderful presentation and answering our questions.